Hey, Professor Spooner, how are you?
Good morning, Frank. I'm well, thanks, and I hope you are too.
Thank you.
I must say the news this week has been, what should I say, new and somewhat interesting in different ways that are different from usual. First, the heat wave in Europe and the temperatures of over 110 degrees in Paris. And secondly, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, telling us that liberalism doesn't work anymore and we should stop talking about it. And I thought that these were both very interesting indicators of where we are now in what we've been calling the crucial phase of globalization. And we talked last week about the way that the context of this crucial phase has developed over the last 150 years or so, with population growth, expanding arenas of interaction, and then the increasingly different ways in which people contextualize each other in society, and the fact that everything that's significant in human history is a social development, has to do, even though there may be biological factors in it, nevertheless, the main things are the way we interact with each other and relate to each other and understand each other. And this has been changing faster and faster, and it still gets relatively little attention, even from social scientists, which is something that's always amazed me since I was trained as a social scientist myself and still continued on. Everything about the which is really the most important factor in everything about us, gets very little academic or scientific attention. And now we're getting to the point where the context within our lives operate so because it began, as we said last week, 10,000 years ago with an amazingly innovative change in our relationship to natural environment. Resource began producing our own food. More and more complex ever since then at an accelerating rate. As we settled before we started producing food, but the settlement allowed us to get property, and then we differentiated among ourselves as a result of differences in the property that we owned, and then various innovations which enabled us to make our natural environment much more complex and no longer simply a natural environment, but a technological environment as well. And now, more recently, with the amazing development of information technology, the diversification of human life on a global level, with not only people with different levels of ability because of different property, but different levels of ability because of different ways, different degrees of ability to develop, to deal with information. And the third thing was in the news this week that I wanted to bring up in relation to this is another book has been published with the title Collective Intelligence. And I mean, it was David Christian who began the new discipline of what was called Big History 30 years ago, who began talking about collective learning and the fact that with more and more minds in human minds in close contact with each other, interrelating with each other, dealing with the same problems, our ability is so much, human ability is so much greater than it had been when we were in small groups, In fact, the ability now on a global level is amazing, but we haven't got used to it. So we've got all these problems in the world at the moment, which are global problems. First, our relationship with the environment, which we've got to manage, and we've never had to do that before. And it's going to take us a while not only to get used to the fact that we've got to do it, but work out exactly how to do it. Because the most deficient part of our increasing abilities under globalization is the way we organize ourselves, for both in general for political reasons and also on different other scales for the optimum uses of the various types of technology. We have to I mean, each of these pieces of news that I've referred to show us that organization is a crucial problem now in much more significant ways than it was in the past.
You know, all of with the exception of the climate change one, the effects of these changes at a disaggregated individual human level are understandable. I understand them. But if you're the United States, for example, the United States government, and you are becoming aware of an impending threat, as the Pentagon, for example, became aware of global climate change as a threat half a dozen or so years ago, began to list it as a factor in their annual threat assessment because they understood that this was going to cause geopolitical change that could lead to defense implications. Do you think there's a similar awareness going on at a national security level as to the changing global perspective of the United States? And similarly, in other countries around the world, do you think national governments are understanding that this increasing speed of globalization, of course, is affecting people on an individual level, but is in fact affecting international perspectives of their countries and governments themselves? I mean, is this something that's articulated, do you think, and out loud? Or because you mentioned that even social scientists in your own field are not really paying any attention to this or not talking about it, but yet this is something that could ultimately have very dire effects if you're a political regime.
This is something that I'm glad you brought this up because it's another aspect of what I had in mind, that if we're going to become a global community, we each have to know more about the rest of the community in different parts of the world. And one of the biggest problems in international politics at the moment is the amount of well, for example, I've often said this before, that I think that the Foreign Office in Washington is amazingly ignorant about the rest of the world, and yet wants to organize a foreign policy for America, which in fact makes America the world's policeman. Mm-hmm. So I mean, so many of the political problems of the world have to do with each country not knowing enough about the people that they're dealing with. As a nation which has been of organizing, taken the place of it as the last couple of 100 years, very gradually and not entirely until the middle of the last century. As it ceases to work as well as it seemed to work in the 20th century, we really have no way of well, it makes our problem of organization that much greater on a global level, because the people who are in positions of responsibility to try to develop new ways of organizing simply don't have enough knowledge about the larger context in which the organization has to take place.
It's a very difficult challenge because there's such a latency in response, a response equaling action for leaders to determine how effective or ineffective whatever policies they're taking may be. I mean, it's not as if you're able to have instant polling. It's just this incremental perspective change that is happening. That is, it's difficult to gauge. I mean, you can gauge it when things occur, and when events occur, and you can begin to see the reactions of people to them, and you can go, oh my God, how can people act that way or think that way? But absent those events happening, you don't really know how people are thinking or how people are interpreting things.
Yeah. And of course, the biggest problem with the nation state era is that some nation states were empires that managed to turn themselves into nation states and are enormous, like China and Russia, whereas other nation states are very small, and in fact, they were small colonial districts that, as the empires came to an end in the middle of the 20th century, the only way they could make the transition into the next phase was to become nation states themselves. So we've got the small nation states in the Pacific and other parts of the world at one end of the spectrum, and China and Russia and maybe a few others like Brazil, which are very large, at the other end. And this just doesn't work.
No.
But it's very difficult to see how we're going to make the transition to something that is more workable on a global level.
Well, let me ask you this, just as a question. Last week, we had the leaders of the 20 top nations in the world together in one place for their one of their annual confabs. What did you make of both the meeting and anything that has publicly been released about the meeting?
Well, it was, I mean, the leaders of the larger states got more attention than the leaders of the smaller states. Which again is an extension of those problems I've been talking about. I think that these conflabs don't really solve any problems, except maybe increase the amount of awareness on the part of some leaders of what's going on in other parts of the world. But they don't really seem to me to solve any problems.
No.
Or make any progress towards the solution of problems. And we have the same difficulty, of course, with the United Nations, which is the only project that has been thought up so far to bring everybody together and get everybody to talk to each other. But the United Nations is a very disappointing organization. Because it's a lot of people in airplanes going from one conference to another. And I've been to several of them myself because I worked for the United Nations 40 years ago for a while. But I was always disappointed because we never seemed to come up with anything very useful.
Well, the key is, though, is that the institution is in place, the mechanism is in place. There are practitioners in each country that understand how the mechanism works. And in the event of a global changing kind of event, whatever it may be, that mechanism will be ready to be used by people should they wish to use it. And where else, again, and I've used this example in the past, if there's the breakout of a particularly lethal disease that's popping up in a dozen countries at once, where else, in what other form, is that kind of discussion and response mechanism going to be debated?
No, that's an interesting point. I mean, the things that are changing that are not social, such as global health and the rising sea level, may force changes that will make us think in new ways and could actually lead to some useful decisions being made. But unfortunately, perhaps I'm an optimist generally, so I always expect the best thing to happen. And if the best thing doesn't happen, then I wait for the next best thing to happen.
Well, it may be that the best thing to happen might be the response to something that is beyond our control. A non-socially created event that we need to deal with. Let's put it like that.
I think so. I think that's what we'd have to hope for.
Well, on this very last day of June 2019, thank you very much, Professor, and we'll look forward to continuing this starting in July.
Okay. See you next week.
Bye.